Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch the interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me. Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire. Is one nation, one election in the national interest, as the government claims, or could it seriously damage India's democracy, its federalism, and the right of its citizens to exercise their vote? That's the key issue I shall discuss today with India's former Law Minister and one of the country's most highly regarded constitutional lawyers, Kapil Sibal. Mr. Sibal, let's first focus on the desirability of one nation, one election. The government claims that it's in the national interest. Do you agree?
Well, there's a problem. I don't know what the national interest is. Considering the disparities in terms of geography and federal structure in India, it'll be impossible to implement it. So I don't know how it's in the national interest.
Let me put to you two reasons why people who support one nation, one election believe it's in the national interest. The first is the cost. Now, there's no doubt that if all elections are held together once every 5 years, it will be cheaper than spreading them out over 5 years. But is cost such a concern for a country that proudly boasts that it's the mother of democracy?
Oh, absolutely not. Cost is, according to me, wholly irrelevant. And if this is accepted, it means that elections that were held in 7 phases, 5 phases, 6 phases were all unnecessary. They could have been held in 1 phase.
In fact, on the specific issue of cost, a recent article in The Hindu by Shashi Tharoor and Praveen Chakravarti, and they are citing estimates done by the government, by the Election Commission, and by Niti Aayog. They point out that if elections are spread over 5 years, as is the case and custom at the moment, the cost would be rupees 10 per voter per year. If elections are held altogether once every 5 years, the cost would be rupees 5 per voter per year. That is a difference of under 5,000 crore. Now, for an economy the size of India, is that a saving worth worrying about?
Not at all. I think that's a wholly irrelevant factor. The more serious issue is the structural issue, because we are a federal, quasi-federation, right? And unless you consult the federation itself, how do you implement this? I mean, the stakeholders are the states in this country. And they have to come on board as far as cost is concerned.
I'll come to the federal issue in a moment's time, but let me put you a second reason why supporters of one nation, one election think it's a great idea. They say that the restrictions of the minimum code of conduct will only apply for a very short duration period. Now, once again, is that really a concern? Because the the code of conduct only becomes restrictive at a time of national elections when it applies to the country as a whole. When state elections happen, they only apply to the state and for a limited period. So again, is this a matter of concern?
Who follows it, Karan? Well, forget about it, that it applies in a short period. I've seen the establishment violating on daily basis, including the Prime Minister. So the code of conduct, who implements it? Not the Election Commission, though they say there's a code of conduct in place. They don't implement it when it comes to the establishment. They only implement it against the opposition.
So what you're saying is this claim that the restrictions of the code of conduct will be limited is actually a false claim, because even when it applies nationwide, no one observes it.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
In other words, those restrictions are breached, so don't claim that their removal is going to be a benefit.
Exactly.
Okay, let's then come to two opposite arguments. These are arguments against one nation, one election. And the first argument has been made by Verghese George, the senior editor of The Hindu. He says the most fundamental freedom of expression in a democracy is voting. One nation, one election puts restrictions on that. So even if a government loses its majority, under one nation, one election, ways will be found to keep parliament functioning and thus deny voters the right to elect another parliament.
Or take a case where the finance bill is defeated. What happens? Under any parliamentary democracy, the government has to go. But in this concept, the government will not go. Right? And given the kind of things that are happening in parliament and how elected governments are being displaced, you're going to have people being bought over, even when the government has lost the vote on the finance bill. And on any other issue, it becomes a minority.
So you have two anomalies. One, when a government falls under one nation, one election, instead of immediately giving the voters a right to choose a new parliament, you instead find ways of keeping the old parliament continuing.
Absolutely.
That is the denial of the right to the voter. And the second anomaly is one you've just pointed out, that if a government can't pass the budget or the finance bill, as you called it, right, that government ought to resign immediately. Yet here, ways will be found to keep it surviving, and so you will have a government limping along,
Absolutely.
which has failed to pass a budget.
Absolutely. And if it's in a minority, they'll buy over people. As you know, they've been doing it in states.
So worse still, one nation, one election actually provides not just the opportunity, but the requirement to buy people over. You're encouraging horse trading.
Absolutely. That's a very serious issue.
Let me put a second argument against one nation, one election. Again, it's made by Verghese George, that senior editor of The Hindu. He says, in India, the object should be to expand and deepen our democracy. I know for a fact that almost 50 years ago in 1974, Atal Bihari Vajpayee actually wanted a right of recall. He was arguing in favor of it. But we don't have such a right in India.
Of course not.
Now, under one nation, one election, instead of widening and deepening our democracy, we'll be clearly narrowing and restricting it, because you're restricting the right of citizens to exercise their vote rather than choose a new parliament.
Oh, absolutely. And take a case where the state, in the state assembly, the chief minister says, I want to go for election, dissolves the assembly. What happens?
He loses that right.
Absolutely.
I mean, something like this was attempted in Britain. I think I'm right in saying in 2010, 2011, they passed a law of a fixed-term parliament, which meant that prime ministers lost their prerogative, centuries-old prerogative, to call an early election. They could only do so if two-thirds of parliament voted for it. 2 or 3 years ago, this was deemed by the Brits themselves to be an error, and they revoked their own bill. So they've gone through this, and they've revoked it. We are still determined to make the same mistake.
Quite frankly, Karan, if I may say so, and I haven't said so before, as it is, our democracy is an ICU. And the doctors who have to take care of it are the judges of the court. And if they try to take care of it, they're transferred out. So as it is, we are limping as a democracy. And this will push the nail in the coffin of democracy.
And the worst of it is, there is the British example before us.
Absolutely.
They tried to have a fixed-term parliament. Within 8 or 9 years, they ditched it. We still insist on trying to go down the same route.
But the problem is that there's a difference between Britain and us. Our federal structure is far wider, far more expansive.
They don't really have a federal structure.
They don't have a federal structure. So therefore, that question doesn't arise in India.
Let's then come to that federal structure issue, because it is to do fundamentally with the implications of the constitutional amendments that are necessary to make one nation, one election actually happen. What you need to do is to synchronize elections. And that means an amendment which will make some Vidhan Sabhas shrink in their tenure so that they can have elections at the same time as the Lok Sabha, and other Vidhan Sabhas will expand in their tenure so that they can coincide with the Lok Sabha. Either way, what you're doing is that you are making a mockery arbitrarily of the mandate given by the voter. Each voter has given these Vidhan Sabhas a 5-year term. Now, without reference to him or her, you're just changing it.
That's right. And how do you do it? How do you do it? You do it through an amendment of the Constitution, that is Article 83 and 172, I think. You do that. And how do you do that? By exercising power under 356. There is no other way to do it.
But there's also an inherent unfairness here. For instance, just to take an example, it's arguable that the UP Assembly may have to truncate its tenure and lose 6 months or a year.
What about Karnataka?
And on the other hand, Karnataka would lose 4 years.
Yes.
Other assemblies, again, I'm just picking the name out of a hat, might get an additional year or two. How's it fair?
No, they can't get an additional year or two. That's a constitutional requirement. Cannot get. If it's a 5-year term, it's a 5-year term. That's the judgments of the Supreme Court.
Well, you can amend the constitution
No,
to
you
twist it up
can't.
because Indira Gandhi did it.
That'd
Remember
be
in
in
76?
violation of the basic structure. No, that's different. This is violation of the basic
So in other
structure.
words, every assembly would have its term truncated to synchronize with the Lok Sabha.
That's right.
Right? But some could lose up to 4 years, some could lose 1 year. How do you justify that?
You cannot. That's the point. You cannot. And you have to exercise your powers under 356. And you can't do that either.
So not only is this sort of constitutional amendment constitutionally repugnant, but it's also deeply unfair because the assemblies that lose part of their tenure will not lose equal amounts. Some could lose 3 years, some could lose 1 year.
No, but why
It's
should
just
that
not fair.
happen? The voter has decided to put them in government. Who is the parliament to say, no, we'll disregard the voter and do what we like?
That's the moral question.
Yes,
So
absolutely.
this sort of constitutional amendment to make one nation, one election happen is constitutionally repugnant. It's morally repugnant to the voter. It's also unfair to the assemblies because they'll be losing different amounts of time. They won't lose the same amount.
Absolutely.
A second set of constitutional amendments that are required is to handle that key problem. What happens under one nation, one election if a government collapses before its 5-year term is over? Before I go into the possibilities, would you agree that imposing president's rule in Vidhan Sabhas for the remaining part of those 5 years is intolerable and unacceptable, and you simply can't do that at the center because it's not permitted?
No, you can't do it for the simple reason, on what grounds will we dissolve the assembly? On what grounds under 356 will you dissolve the assembly? You cannot. 356 is only meant when the government has failed and cannot function in accordance with the provisions of the Constitution. You are making it not function in accordance with the provisions of the Constitution by saying that, look, now we'll have one election, one nation, one election. You can't do that. I mean, there is no constitutional provision under which you can do that.
I accept the point you're making, but people are saying that if under one nation, one election, a government collapses for whatever reason after 2 years, what do you do for the remaining 3? One answer is impose president's rule, but you can't impose president's rule for 3 years.
No, of course you cannot, but you'll have to have an election then. You can't impose. You see, if you impose president's rule, the idea is to restoration of democracy. And you can't wait for 3 years to restore democracy.
And you can't have an election because you've got one nation, one election, and you've got a fixed tenure.
Absolutely.
So you've ended up in an absurdity.
No, but what they will say is that, look, you can have a minority government.
But
Because
a
the
minority
Constitution-
government could be repeatedly defeated on the floor of the same house.
No, what they will say, yes, of course it could be. And that's why I said it will lead to horse trading. That's what the point I made earlier. This minority will become a majority because they'll pick up people from the other side.
So once again,
Yeah.
the situation is being exacerbated because you're opening the door to horse trading,
Absolutely.
which means corruption, which
Absolutely.
means actually the denial of democracy.
That's what's going to happen if this goes through. It'll be carte blanche for people to buy each other.
Now, some people say the solution, whether it's at the center or at the state level, if a government collapses before 5 years are over, is to have the German concept of a constructive vote of confidence, which means, in effect, that you can't vote a government out unless at the same time you can vote a new government in. Now, on paper and in theory, that sounds very good. But does it always work in practice? Let me give you an example. Suppose a ruling party with a majority breaks, and the breakaway faction refuses to join the opposition. You'll then end up with a government that's lost its majority, but you can't have an election because it's a fixed-term parliament, and so this broken government without a majority will have to limp for the remaining part of the 5 years.
But that's an academic question for the simple reason that broken majority will ultimately, to survive, because it can still be voted out, but to survive it will have to buy people to become majority.
Or you would have a situation analogous to what happened in 79 when the Janata Party collapsed. And Jagjeevan Ram inherited the majority of the Janata Party, but he didn't join either Congress, nor did he support Charan Singh. Charan Singh instead got Indira Gandhi's support to form a government, and on the very day Parliament met, she withdrew her support. So we'll be into that sort of stupidity and absurdity repeatedly.
But even if you withdraw support, you will still continue.
Which
in
is
that
even worse.
scenario,
Absolutely
in that
even
scenario,
worse.
then where do you go from there?
So you actually end up with an absurdity. A government that's patently lost its majority, still forced to continue because elections can't be held, and therefore required to buy support
Absolutely.
through nepotism and corruption.
But look at the experience we've had. Elected governments have been thrown out by buying people, and illegal governments are in place in Maharashtra. And this is when elected governments, there has been no vote, there's been no vote against. It is pursuant to the fact that people have defected, been bought over, and they're running the government, which is per se illegal.
And that will happen on a wholesale basis
Absolutely.
under this.
This is, as I said, wholesale corruption will happen.
This is where the example you brought up earlier of a coalition government not being able to pass the budget becomes very relevant. Because if you have a German-style, what's it called, constructive vote of confidence, and a coalition can't pass a budget, right? That coalition will still retain the numbers, but it will be a government that's failed to pass a budget, and you'll have this peculiar situation of a government without a budget continuing in office for 5 years.
The other problem is there's no anti-defection law in Germany.
Which does...
Which even makes it even worse. You have an anti-defection law here.
Yeah.
So then what do? If people actually join the other side and you still have an anti-defection law, then who's going to decide on the defection? Again, horse trading. Again, money. Speaker is their speaker. He will never decide the matter.
In fact, one of the things that the committee that's been appointed to study the issue has to look into is the validity of the anti-defection law. Presumably, for the argument that you're just suggesting, they'll have to do away with the anti-defection law.
And if they do away, then be horse trading in the open.
No.
So where do you go from here?
The situation gets worse and worse and worse the more you analyze it.
Exactly.
Now, there is one suggestion made several years earlier by the Election Commission to specifically cater for the sort of situation we're talking about, where a government, whether at the center or the state, loses its majority for whatever reason before 5 years are over. The Election Commission's suggestion is hold specifically for that particular government an election, but only for the remaining period of the 3-year term. And I put it to you that this is bizarre, because what it's doing is it's playing around with the value of the voter's vote. In some instances, voters will be voting for a 5-year mandate. Now suddenly, for a particular election, they'll be voting for just a 2-year mandate. Can you have two different types of votes in a democracy?
So what does it do to the issue of cost then? You raise the issue of cost. What happens then? You don't have that cost argument available to you if you allow this to happen.
Although presumably it will be a specific cost for one assembly.
It can happen in several assemblies. Why just in one state?
I take your point. The cost factor would be clearly undermined. But what about the second thing? That on some occasions you're saying to the Indian voter, you're exercising a mandate to elect for 5 years. Now suddenly, because the government has collapsed, you're only exercising a mandate for 2 years or 3.
Karan, you see how our democracy, so-called democracy, works in India. If in a situation where people who are elected for a 5-year term actually go over to the other side, in every case where the opposition is in power, what will happen is they will buy over people from one party, make the government fall, and then continue for the balance period. That's what's going to happen.
In almost every scenario that we discuss, we come back to horse trading, don't we?
Yeah.
So no matter what the scenario, this is a system, one nation, one election, which eventually relies upon buying people over, getting them to cross the floor, right? And if the anti-defection law continues, then technically that is impossible. Yet if they still do it, who then decides the issue?
Exactly. And who has money in this country? Which political party has all the money? The others won't be able to buy. Only one party will be able to buy. It will be one nation, one election, and in perpetuity. It will be that party in power in the states and that party in power at the center.
Let's then pull out of the details and let me put to you the German example. In many ways, they are a system similar to us. There's a federal structure. They have state elections. They have national elections. And frequently in Germany, you have 1 or 2 elections every single year.
Absolutely.
And the Germans don't mind. They take it in their stride.
Right.
Why on earth are we incapable of being the same?
Because the BJP wants to rule in all the states and at the center. And they have said they'll rule for the next 30, 40 years. That's their intent.
But there is the German example to tell us that multiple elections, perhaps even several in 1 year, are feasible and possible, and they actually enhance the spirit of democracy.
But you know, what democracy are you talking about, Karan? In this country, where is democracy? I mean, I don't see democracy functioning. even courts are not upholding the values of the Constitution. And I see that happening in judgments. What democracy? The sentinel of the protector of the law allows illegal governments to continue. And it's staring us in the face.
And therefore, what you're saying, I'm extending your argument, is that if one nation, one election throws up more such problems that have to go to courts, that sentinel may not necessarily uphold democracy. It may buckle under when it's most needed.
Well, I'm not talking about buckling, but the kind of judgments that are being rendered is very disturbing.
So at a time when you can't rely on the Supreme Court to give the sort of judgment you want, one nation, one election
I don't
will
want
make
any judgment. I want a judgment consistent with the Constitution.
Okay, same thing.
Yeah.
At a time when you can't rely on the Supreme Court to always give you judgments consistent with the Constitution,
Yes.
one nation, one election will make the situation for Indian democracy worse.
Much worse. In fact, as I said to you, that the Supreme Court is the doctor when democracy is in ICU, and the doctor is not treating the patient.
Let's then come to three specific concerns about one nation, one election that arise out of the sort of democracy India has been. They may not apply to other democracies, but they apply very specifically to us. First, our parliamentary democracy is increasingly becoming presidential in its manner and style in campaigning. If you have one nation, one election, isn't there a terrible danger that that trend will exacerbate and our parliamentary democracy will be increasingly distorted?
We are looking at the permanence of a political party running India. That's the reason why they want this.
That brings me to my second concern. If there's a wave in favor of a national party, as they believe is in favor of the BJP today, or was in favor of Congress when Indira Gandhi was Prime Minister, won't one nation, one election convert a multi-party system
Absolutely.
into a one-party state?
No doubt about it. I have no doubt about it. Multi-party state and a Hindu nation.
And that you believe is their real intention?
Absolutely, without doubt.
They're not actually doing this for cost. They're
No.
not actually doing this because they want to reduce the restrictions of the code of conduct. They're doing it because they believe it will A, create a one-party state, and B, that will itself help them create a Hindu Rashtra.
Absolutely, without a doubt. They'll change the Constitution.
There's one last problem again that I want to put to you. Our experience of 75 years of democracy in India have convinced people that multiple elections is one way of keeping MLAs and MPs accountable and responsive to the people. Now, if despite everything going wrong, there can't be elections until 5 years are over, those MPs are liable to become aloof and arrogant, aren't they?
Oh, absolutely, without doubt. Not just the MPs, all those associated with the establishment, and here I mean the BJP, will not be answerable to anybody. And if there is anybody who's elected on another party ticket, he'll be answerable to everybody, including the establishment.
So on multiple grounds, looking specifically at what happens in India, this is bad. It will distort our parliamentary democracy. It will make us a one-party state. It will make MPs and MLAs less accountable, less responsive.
And therefore, people should wake up. It's time for the people of our country to wake up.
So far from being in the national interest, India or Bharat loses.
Not loses, we lose our freedoms. That's more serious.
Let me at this point ask you a couple of questions about the nature and character of the committee that's been appointed by the government to study this issue. It's headed by a former President, Ram Nath Kovind. Now, I accept he's retired. But presidents are meant to be aloof and above the political fray, not just when they're in office, but equally importantly, when they've demitted office. Isn't that being breached by appointing him as chairman?
Absolutely. And besides, he was I knew him when he was in Supreme Court, but I believe he may have never argued a case.
So he's not a constitutional expert?
Not at all.
Has he made a mistake and damaged the image of the office he once held by
so.
joining this committee?
I think so.
So he lacks the expertise to be chairman, but he's also let down the office he once held.
Absolutely. He should. And some of the others should also not have joined, I'm sorry to say.
But of President Kovind, this is particularly important because one looks up to presidents, whether they're in office or retired. He's done things that he should never have done by joining this as head.
Absolutely. He's not a member of a political party. He should not be in any case.
And this is clearly a political issue that he's presiding over.
Absolutely. And they will say, because he was president, you must respect his opinion.
You can say the opposite. Because he was president, he's actually damaged the image of the office.
I'm just saying what the other side will say.
Second, the committee, now that Adhir Ranjan Chaudhary has opted out,
Yes.
does not have any political representation other than the BJP.
You see, which are the entities which are most concerned with this? The states.
They're not there.
Huh?
Not a single
That's what
regional
I'm
party
saying.
is there.
Who is representing the states? So how do you change, how do you bring one nation, one vote without the federal polity being represented?
So this is a major flaw, because any decision this committee reaches will not have political consensus behind it.
Not at all. That's why they'll shove it through. I mean, they will.
And there's something even worse. Even if supposedly this committee is unanimous in whatever it decides, because no opposition party is represented and because not a single regional party, it will look one-sided and it will look as if it lacks consensus.
If they try and do it, it'll be the downfall of this government. Because even those who are their allies, because this will have to go through Rajya Sabha, no matter what they do. They'll have the majority in the Lok Sabha. Will never pass in Rajya Sabha.
Are you really confident that parties like BJD
Never.
or the Rajshekhar
Because
Reddy
they'll
Congress,
be finished themselves. They'll know that this is their death knell.
So if
nobody
they
will
try
support
to
them.
push this to the Rajya Sabha, you're saying it will be defeated?
It will be defeated. It will be the beginning of the downfall of the BJP.
Many of the constitutional amendments that require not only have to get a two-thirds majority in both houses of the central parliament, but they also have to be voted upon in at least 15 state assemblies.
But that may not be necessarily right unless some of these changes are challenged on the grounds that it's violative of the implied limitations of the Constitution in the context of the basic structure.
But some of the changes may require a contraction in the mandate and tenure of state assemblies.
That's not necessarily true, because that's not included in 368 of the Constitution. You see, there are some provisions of the Constitution that require what you're saying,
And others
two-thirds plus half the states. Now, Article 83 doesn't come within that. Article 85 doesn't come within that. 172 and 174 doesn't come within that.
So even if they can avoid having to be ratified by 15 states, the problem will be at the Rajya Sabha level.
Unless you say it's violative of the basic structure and the court says you can't do it.
Which is also possible. But let me put my last question to you. Everyone believes, and I will say this is an assumption people are making, that this government intends to push this through so that the election in 2024 May is on the basis of one nation, one election.
I don't think that can be done.
Because there isn't enough time, or because it will be opposed to the Rajya Sabha, or for both reasons?
For several reasons. Can't be done. I think this is too short a time. The states will revolt. I mean, revolt not in that sense, but they will oppose it tooth and nail. I think it'll impact the people of this country, and the people of this country will start realizing what the intent is. It won't pass through Rajya Sabha, and it'll be the downfall of this of the BJP.
You've said that for the second time. You really believe that if they try and push
Yes.
through one nation, one election, it will be the downfall of the BJP?
Without any doubt.
Because of failure to pass it, and therefore the embarrassment, or because the people themselves will rise against
Apart from the people, see, those political parties in the Rajya Sabha who vote for them occasionally, none of them will vote for them, because they know that if they vote for them, they will not be in power.
But might this not provide a message to the people that this is simpler, it's easier, it's more efficient, and therefore they may get popular backing?
Message of the people doesn't matter, because it's the states who have to vote. I mean, there are all kinds of messages to the people through Godi media nowadays. But people,
So you're saying
people necessarily don't buy it.
So you're saying the BJP is playing with fire?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely.
And this is a fire that won't just singe their hands, it could burn them completely.
It will burn them. I'm absolutely convinced about that.
So your message to Mr. Modi is, if you persist with this, you're committing political suicide.
I will say persist with it so that you can actually do what I think will happen.
In other words, please go ahead, Mr. Modi.
Yes.
Do it as swiftly and as forcefully as you can,
Absolutely.
because I predict your political end.
Absolutely.
Kapil Sibal, on that note, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch the interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me.